Good morning, all distinguished invitees and participants. Welcome to the Task Force 5 T20 India site event, titled Building Bridges to Sustainable Finance, Reform Agenda of International Financial Institutions. Allow me to reintroduce myself. My name is Gifari, and I am a researcher at the LPM FABOE. I will be your master of ceremony for today's public discussion with a topic of the need for reforming international financial institutions. For this session, we will also have online participants joining us virtually. During the Q&A session, online participants are warmly welcome to ask questions through the Q&A box on Zoom. For today's discussion, I am honored to welcome Mr. Andrea Brugora as the chair of this public discussion. Mr. Brugora is a research fellow at the ISP Geoeconomics Center. Further, I would also like to welcome our panelist, Mr. Chatib Basri, Professor Ashima Goyal, and Mr. Matthew Agarwala. Mr. Chatib Basri is a senior lecturer at the University of Indonesia, whereas Professor Ashima Goyal is the Honorable Chair of Task Force 5 T20 India, also holding a position as an emeritus professor of economics at the Indira Gandhi Institute for Development Research, and Mr. Matthew Agarwala is an economist from Bennett Institute for Public Policy at the University of Cambridge. To kickstart this public discussion, I invite Mr. Brugora to take the floor and lead the session. Mr. Brugora, the stage is yours.
Thank you. And thank you for choosing a picture in which I'm so young. I am not anymore, unfortunately. So I'm very grateful of being for the first time in Bali and in this country that I see so relevant geographically, economically, and politically for the future of Asia and of the world, of course. And I'm honored to chair this session and would like to thank Professor Bang Bang and our Vice President, ISP Vice President Paolo Magri for the invitation and trust. We already had a broad discussion yesterday and this morning with 4+1 sessions that gave us very rich hints. And the aim of this session is to synthesize the main points and to open the discussion to a wider audience. So I would like to say hello also to the people that are connected online by live streaming, and also, if it's possible, to deepen the key points of our discussion up to now. As you may know, we're facing a paradox nowadays. On one side, every country, think tank, and organization agrees on the urgency of the reform of international financial institutions, and on the other hand, reforms proceed with an unclear timing and agenda. Yesterday emerged clearly that speed is a very key variable for the success of this process. We had the chance to share other key points yesterday, such as the role of private finance, which is crucial to expand available resources. Public money can attract private money, and pension funds should have a specific attention in this because of their long-term attitude and of the quantity of resources they can bring. To allow this integration from private finance, many elements should be addressed, such as a global stability for which the global financial architecture and macroprudential regulation, as well as debt distress, are key issues. And also, there is the need for local trust and de-risking. This can be in part the role that we identified for global financial institutions and as well for multilateral development banks, and of course also for that can be integrated with national resources and funds. The role of these multilateral development banks and international financial institutions should also be to push funds in the good directions, and especially towards sustainability. And emerged also the need of strengthening the relationship with the private sector. That could mean getting very close, probably also to something that is not far from educating the private sector about global issues. Another key point that emerged is that there is a need to combine global perspective with country-specific solutions, and that this might seem obvious, but is always good to remark that there is a lot to lose with rising instability, especially coming from the triangle USA, Russia, China, and their interactions. Since 1 or 2 years, politics seems to have gained priority over economics. And in this process, I see as key actors the European Union, and if it will have the ability to position itself as a unique actor and balancing in the interactions with this triangle, and the leadership of India in the forthcoming G20. And also in guiding countries that don't want to align to any of these blocks that are seem to be built. There is the need to look for common denominators as political entry points of economic solutions, and climate can be one entry point to address the broader topic of sustainability. The Bretton Woods system was positively designed to address economic and financial sustainability, but it is clear that it needs an update, and this update can rely on some public goods, so not just capital, but also trade, health, environment can be addressed for a reform that should be not just probably of international financial institutions, but also of the global governance, including other institutions such as the WTO and so on. It also emerged that in the ESG conception of sustainability, the S has an important relevance, and so it is important to address poverty and rising inequalities that are increasing also in the global north, so-called, and so also should be in the priority of their agenda too. It is made clear that taxonomy, regulations, and data acquisition as well need development and standard definition and identification, and not necessarily we should rely only on one standard, as developed and emerging countries could have different needs. However, my impression is that besides many technical issues, at this point governance is the key element. And in this sense, we could draw an example from the European Union history, where bringing practical issues ahead has taken the building and reform of institutions together by starting from sharing resources such as carbon and nuclear power, and then we got to closer political unification. Also, we would need a stakeholder engagement system, probably some forms of coordination, such as a consortium of MDBs, could help. And we clarified, it is very clear to everyone that T20, G20, T7, and G7 are very important platforms to give pressure and guidance to this process. So I hope I have given a good synthesis of all that has emerged, and I would like to ask to our first panelist, Professor Basri, which are the challenges and opportunities that he sees in this process at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Andrea, I think you have provided a very good summary for our discussion yesterday, and the things that I would like to raise in my remarks is perhaps to elaborate some points that Andrea already made. Yeah. First of all, I would like to thank the T20 India for having me, and also we had a very good discussion yesterday regarding the reforming of this international financial institution. So let me start by providing a background why we need to reform the international financial institution. We are facing multifaceted crises at this moment, which include the issue of health, climate change, and also this geopolitical tension. And these issues pose major threat for the country's ability to protect their development gains and also prevent countries to achieve their future improvement in living standard. So we've made a lot of progress, but there is a risk that the recent development will prevent many countries all over the world, especially the emerging developing economies, to make an improvement in their living standards. And the target to achieve, for example, shared prosperity and ending the extreme poverty become more difficult under this kind of situation. I would like to say that the world badly needs the global cooperation, but what we are facing today is the risk of the global fragmentation, yeah, especially because this geopolitical tension. We learn about the rising of this techno-nationalism, for example, the digital divide, yeah, and this kind of issues somehow have an impact to the global economy. In addition to that, the pandemic has left us with scarring effect in many developing and emerging economies. The first impact was on poverty. So the number of poor people increased quite substantially during the pandemic. And the implication of this, because one of the sector that was hit severely during the pandemic was informal sector, and most of the workers who work in the informal sector, mostly women. So there was an implication about widening of the gender gap. Yeah. And there is one interesting study conducted by Asian Development Bank. They provide a very gloomy figure by saying that during the pandemic was about 27% of people in ASEAN did not have access for the online education. So there is a risk of the setback of the quality of the human capital. We haven't seen the impact now, but we probably will see, the impact about 5 to 10 years from now. So the implication for all of these issues that I just mentioned is there is a need for design of the fiscal policy to be more inclusive. I can imagine that the budget allocation for health, for climate, for the protection for the vulnerable groups need to be increased. But at the same time, we are facing a problem because the G7 countries need to do the normalization of this macroeconomic policy. We are facing an issue about this rising interest rate at this moment, financial instability due to the large capital inflow. So there is a need of dialogue between the emerging developing economies, the so-called the global south, and also the G7 on this. And I do believe that the role of this international financial institution is very crucial here. The first aspect that I would like to touch is the implication of it. I mentioned about there is a need for the more inclusive fiscal policy. But we understand that in many countries all over the world, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, their fiscal space is limited. So the first implication is the issue of the debt distress. This is the thing that I believe that the Bretton Woods institution need to look at this issue carefully, because the so-called the global south badly need the support for the financing of their fiscal. But because this fiscal space is limited, if they continue to rely so much on the external financing, there is a risk that the country become vulnerable, especially with the rising interest rate in the G7 countries. The second aspect related to the fiscal space is the limited resources. Yeah, we cannot entirely rely for the quote-unquote the conventional model. So there is a need to think about the importance of this innovative financing, whether this has to do with the blended finance or scheme that can help the emerging developing economies. I'll touch about this issue later on. If the domestic resources is limited, especially related to the fiscal space, then many countries all over the world will depend on external financing. I would like to raise one of the issue that's important. This is a rather paradox. Many developing countries, since they are not a producer of this capital, so logically, by using the comparative advantage, they need to import capital from the advanced country. So if Global South wants to grow, they need to run the current account deficit because they need a capital on it. But nowadays, once your current account deficit go beyond 3%, you'll be punished by the international investors. Yeah. So the depending on the external financing will create the vulnerabilities. So based on this background, so let me highlight some of issues that we discussed yesterday. My colleague, my good friend Amar Bhattacharya mentioned in his remarks yesterday about the importance to discuss about the issue of the financial instability. And I completely agree, especially from the perspective of the Global South, that's become a big issue at this moment. Because on the one hand, we need external financing, but if we rely too much on the external financing, there is a risk of the vulnerability. So the question is, what can we do about it? Is there any role for the Bretton Woods institution, the international financial institution related to this issue? Of course, there are many possible schemes that we can discuss, but one thing that came up to my mind, learned from this, at least in the last 15 years after the global financial crisis, I think we cannot entirely rely on the so-called the impossible trinity, in the sense that in economic terms, we do understand that mitigating the capital inflow according to the conceptual framework is very easy. If you use the exchange rate as the only shock absorber, you can solve this problem. But lesson learned from many emerging developing economies shows the opposite. And there is one interesting study done, I think, by Elon Ray back on 2013 about the global cycle. So with this kind of situations, we learned that in many emerging developing economies, they cannot only focus on the one single objective of the monetary policy, like focusing on inflation, but at the same time, they need to manage the exchange rate fluctuation as well. So with the multiple monetary objective and the risk of the exchange rate overshoot, I'm talking about the Indonesian experience. Every time the currency depreciated, people start to worry that the Asian financial crisis back because the exchange rate is terrorist. Yeah. And also the balance sheet effect. And under this kind of situation, I think there is a need to look at again about the role of the capital flows management. Yeah, of course, this issue need to be discussed further because we need to be very careful as well. We don't want to discourage the capital inflow coming in into the emerging developing economies, but managing the capital flows, I think, is also very important. Some possible options that may be macroprudentials, or maybe FX intervention, not to pegging the level, but smoothing the volatility. Yeah. So this is perhaps one of the issues that need to be discussed when we talk about this reforming international financial institution, especially to related to the issue of financial stabilities. The second aspect that I would like to discuss is about the availability of the resources, because as I think it was pointed out by Secretary Yellen about a year ago, Secretary Yellen mentioned that the Bretton Woods institution was not designed to address of the multifaceted crisis, health, climate, geopolitical. So somehow, it won't be surprised if we are facing about this issue of the limited resources at this moment. Yeah, we cannot rely so much on the role of the global south because their fiscal space is limited. But at the same time, in G7 countries, they are facing so many burning issues that they have to deal. So the question is, what kind of innovation that the international financial institution can focus on? There are two possibilities of it. Of course, the ideal one, in my view, is to add the additional resources. Yeah, but this is not easy given the geopolitics tension and also the economic situation. I can imagine that even for the G7 countries, it's not easy to add the additional resources for the Bretton Woods institution. So the other option is improve financial model with this balance sheet optimization. In my view, I think we should do both. Yeah, to add additional resources and also improve financial model balance sheet optimization. And we probably need to think and come up about some innovative source of financing, because the domestic resources is limited. The source of the external financing is also limited. The role of the MDBs is limited. The role of the private financing become very crucial here. So the role of this international financial institution like the Bretton Woods is how can they come up with the idea of the innovative financing for the risking in order to attract the private financings to come. Yeah. Talking about, especially in the, let me give an example about the climate finance. There is an excellent a paper, I would call it as the state of the art of the climate finance nowadays, written by Nick Stern, Vera Songwe, and Amar Bhattacharya. And in their report, they mention about the importance of combination about the domestic resources mobilization, about the external financing, support from the MDBs, like increasing the, for example, like the concessional loan, using to work together with the regional development bank by providing the SDR to work with the regional development bank, etc. But I think the most important part is how to attract the private financing on it, because again, the resources is limited. So the role of the innovative financing like blended finance, etc. become very crucial here. Yeah, I don't know how much time do I have, but let me, finish by raising 2 points. After we understand about the background, we know the risk of the financial instability is there. So we need the macro framework. We need additional resources and how to optimize the balance sheet. Now, the third aspect that I would like to touch is about the operating model. Because all of these issues that I mentioned will not work if we don't have the good operating model. So what I have in mind regarding this model is, I don't think the Bretton Woods institution could come up with the policy recommendation like one size fits all. I think this issue has been mentioned several times in our discussion. So the role of the country-based model is very crucial, yeah, but need to be broadened. But there is a cost of it, because I can imagine that the financial institution, the Bretton Woods institution, will be very difficult to tailor every policy based on, in order to be suitable for the every country case. This will be very complicated. So the challenge is how to strike the balance, to balance engagement between country-based model, regional, and global. That will be the challenge. Yeah. The last point that I would like to make before I conclude my remarks is the need for the global cooperation. I mentioned to you earlier. With the rising techno-nationalism due to the geopolitical tension, and one thing that came up now, become a big issue, is to justify everything's based on the economic security. Look at what happened during the pandemic. We were facing the problem of this vaccine nationalism. When you are in trouble, basically you are on your own. Supply chain disruptions. This somehow create a response from many countries to become, to try to be less dependent. In inventory methods, it changed from the just in time to be just in case. Yeah, and some countries try to to focus on their own problems. We are facing in what economists call the prisoner's dilemma. We do understand that the best payoff matrix will be the global corporations, but because the domestic need, we will focus on the short-term issue to focus on the domestic needs. Under this kind of situation, we need to revive again the multilateralism. The question is how? Because the geopolitical tension is there, the fragmentation, the risk of the fragmentation of the global economy is there. So to conclude, I would like to propose one thing. Maybe we have to think about using the pragmatic approach. We do understand there's so many problems, but we can try to find the common denominator, the issue that bring everyone to sit together around the table. So I can give an example about health, because everyone will agree to speak, on the health issue, about the, to protect vulnerable groups, the climate finance, etc. This is perhaps the job that we need to discuss further in order to we can come up with this, maybe couple of recommendations to make sure that we can revive again the multilateralism. I leave it here. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Professor Basri, and especially for clarifying that this is a moment in which multilateralism can be enhanced or could go backwards. Now I would like to ask to the next speaker, Professor Agarwala, if he can help us to understand better how international financial institutions could push the agenda and the resources better towards sustainability and what we could call beyond GDP.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you to the organizers as well and the T20. It is an extreme honor for me to come from Cambridge today and to visit and learn from the expertise in this room. I've been working with Professor Bang Bang now for a couple of years, and it's great to be here for my first time. I'm going to speak about the policy brief that we have actually created, led by Professor Bang Bang and colleagues, for this event and for the G20 and T20, called A Framework to Enhance Financing Capacity and Incentivize Natural Assets Preservation. This has been a paper that's been in the works for several months, and we're happy to be able to release and launch it here. If I could have the next slide, please. Basically, the world faces a common challenge, which is that our economic model over the past century, which has been to maximize GDP growth and maximize the returns on income, is no longer fit for purpose. It has, the pursuit of GDP growth, improved the human condition at a remarkable rate in all parts of the world. We have seen life expectancy extended, literacy rates improved, access to education, to healthcare, to nutrition, the empowerment of women and girls. On every dimension, the human condition has improved with the pursuit of GDP growth in all parts of the world. Unequally, definitely, and that needs to be addressed, but there have been improvements in all parts of the world. The problem is that now, that same economic model of pursuing GDP growth bears different fruits in the 21st century. We have, alongside those improvements in the human condition, released 1.5 trillion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere. We have pushed 1 million species to the brink of extinction, and in just the past 50 years, we have seen a 70% decline in the populations of amphibians, birds, mammals, fish, and species all around the world. And combined, the climate, the biodiversity, and inequality crises that we face threaten to wipe out that century or so of economic gain. And if I could have the next slide, I think that means we need a new economic model. Now, there are two versions of this talk. One is, I now jump into about 20 slides of pretty messy algebra and advanced calculus. And the other, I have condensed it to one slide with 2 pictures on it. So I hope this works for the audience. The way that I would like to describe the new model that we need is to imagine that you are running a bakery. The size of the pie that you can produce in the future depends on the stock of ingredients in your pantry. Run out of ingredients, and then tomorrow's pie will be smaller. Well, it turns out that the economy, whether we're talking about here in Indonesia, here in Bali, or globally, the economy operates just like the bakery, except that the core ingredients of economic prosperity aren't flour and sugar, they are capital assets, wealth. If I could have the next slide, please. And when I speak about capital and wealth, I'm taking a broad view. Not just financial capital, not just buildings and infrastructure, our physical capital, but critically, our natural capital, those elements of the natural world that underpin economic prosperity. A stable climate system, safe, clean air to breathe, a vitality in our ecosystems, healthy oceans, healthy forests, the source of natural resources, renewable and non-renewable, that start pretty much every supply chain. Our natural capital is a fundamental ingredient of economic prosperity. So too is our human capital, which must include the health of the population as well as its education and skills. And I'd like to focus as well on social capital, the trust that we have between individuals, within business and in government, and the ability of communities to overcome collective action problems. Combined, this portfolio of assets determines our inclusive wealth, and our policy brief for this session articulates the importance of an economic model that pursues growth by maintaining and enhancing our economic pantry rather than raiding it. The size of the pie is measured by GDP, but our pantry is our inclusive wealth. And until we have economic statistics that focus on inclusive wealth and that articulate the trends of the changes in natural capital, in human and social capital, I do not think that we will deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals. Those SDGs articulate the outcomes we want, various interpretations of the pie. But it is our inclusive wealth that determines our capacity to deliver it and to achieve it. Now, if I could have the next slide. Why am I going on and on about GDP when what I should be talking about is international financial institutions and multilateral development banks and how they can mobilize the financial system? Part of it is that I had some stock slides, but the other is that I think as the gap widens between what financial markets and IFIs and multilateral development banks think capital is versus what inclusive wealth is doing in the actual pantry, as that gap widens between the market view on capital and the real economy, our inclusive wealth, we're going to see a falling relevance of the financial world and a lack of capacity in the financial world to deliver on our objectives. Now, if there's a group, is this going to be better? Sorry, maybe that's a cue. If there is one group of people in the world who ought to be pretty good at managing capital assets, it is financial markets, international financial institutions, and development banks. Their bread and butter is capital management. What I am advocating for, and what our policy brief advocates for, is that they take their experience and expertise in the management of capital, in supporting its allocation to the highest return endeavors, and we apply it to the broadest possible view of capital, to include natural and human and social capital, and make those priorities just as much as any physical infrastructure investment. And the reason we need to do this is because all capital, human, natural, social, and physical capital, is by definition forward-looking. The value of any asset today is simply the net present value of its future returns. That's Economics 101. That's from Irving Fisher. We've known this for over a century. And what that means is that the difference between a GDP approach to economic development versus a wealth approach to economic development is like the difference between getting a diagnosis from your doctor beforehand versus waiting for the autopsy report afterwards. GDP is an autopsy report. It tells you what happened last year, last quarter. If we want the IFIs and the development banks to be able to deliver a sustainable, prosperous future, they must be forward-looking. And the only economic measures that we have that are genuinely forward-looking are capital, because it's built into the definition. If I could have the next slide, please. Now, countries are waking up to this. The United States has just released earlier this year a natural capital strategy to develop natural capital accounts over the next 15 years. Last year, or 2 years ago now, the UN System of Environmental Economic Accounts was developed. It gives global guidelines on how countries can begin to compile natural capital accounts. And in 2023, the G7 affirmed, and I'm quoting here, that we are working to include environmental economic statistics and natural capital accounting in our core national economic statistics. But I think that's even more important for the G20 than it is for the G7, because that's where the natural capital actually is. We talk about the UK, we have tremendous natural capital accounts. We have some of the most insightful and intellectually rigorous natural capital accounts in the world. But we also have almost no natural capital left. It seems to me that the ability to account for natural capital is almost inversely proportional to the amount of natural capital that's worth accounting for. And that has to change. So if we're talking about what can the multilateral development banks do, this is one of the things. It can build capacity for natural capital and inclusive wealth accounts in the countries where we have the most natural capital that needs to be preserved. And Professor Bambang has been a pioneer of articulating that here in Indonesia, working with Rob Smith, and around the world. But there's another reason, and it's because it's in countries like India and China and Indonesia and Brazil where the co-benefits, the returns to improving air quality, to improving water quality, to better managing flood risk, to having more stable food security, those returns are higher in these countries. And so there is a direct domestic incentive, irrespective of what the rest of the world does, to try to improve the management of natural capital. If I could have the next slide, please. So what do I think that these sorts of accounts can actually do? Well, because they are capital focused, I think they can help us move our economic strategies into the future and forward-looking accounting and forward-looking strategy development. I think they can inform evidence-based decision-making, support learning about relationships within society, to demonstrate how sectors and firms depend on these natural resources and impact them as well. And I think they provide a crucial scorecard whereby the public can hold political decision makers to account and whereby those political decision makers can evaluate their own progress and the impact of their policies. Next slide, please. So, what are the big changes that I think we need? Next slide. Well, I think we have to expand the focus. So move beyond just GDP and income and start thinking about the balance sheet, our inclusive wealth. There is great news that there is so much inertia behind trying to do this at the G7, I hope soon at the G20, at the United Nations, at the World Bank, and even in the way that we calculate GDP, it's changing in order to reflect these in a much more complete way. I think that our credit risk assessments need to be modernized. If you believe, it's not really a belief, is it? If you understand that climate change imposes economic risks and financial risks on society, if you understand that biodiversity loss imposes financial and economic risks on society, then you must also accept that those risks should be factored in to the measurement of creditworthiness. But the problem is that we don't do that at the moment. When I say we, I mean the global financial system. It's not pricing these risks in. There are some papers, some people who say, well, the stock of Exxon changed a little bit after there was a climate change paper. Rubbish. Financial markets are not factoring in climate or biodiversity loss in any real way. The credit ratings agencies, whose job it is to improve the understanding of credit risk and creditworthiness, are also failing to deliver on this promise. There's lots of stuff on their website. If you look at S&P's website, you would think that it is a green startup, not a credit rating agency. But the method that it uses to evaluate the creditworthiness of sovereigns hasn't changed since 2017, and it does not directly reflect climate or biodiversity loss. We need to change that. I think if we could change that, then we would be able to build in the possibility that countries that are making investments in mitigation, in adaptation and resilience, should be rewarded by financial markets rather than punished. If a developing country borrows money to invest in mangrove restoration or river water quality improvement or renewable energy, right now what happens is that increases the debt to GDP ratio, it decreases the credit rating, it increases the cost of capital. That is precisely the opposite signal that we need from financial markets. We have to address that. And I think the way to deliver this is that we need a new international financial institution. I think we need a not-for-profit, publicly owned credit rating agency that can factor these in, and it needs to be publicly financed, and I think that it needs to move beyond its profit, the profit motive that the current rating agencies have. And finally, we have to move away from the Western dominance of the international financial institutions. Professor Basri noted that the Bretton Woods mandate was never to deal with sustainability or climate change or biodiversity loss, and it's absolutely right. I don't know whether we're going to be able to reform the existing institutions sufficiently to deliver this, but I think we absolutely need to increase the voice and the power of developing countries in multilateral development banks and in international financial institutions. I think that's my time.
Thank you. And thank you for giving us the pie metaphor. The possibility to choose quality instead of size is a crucial message that we should convey to global leaders in the world bakery. And now I would like to ask to Professor Goyal, that is also the Task Force 5 chair of G20. Which are the priorities for reforms that she sees for the reform of the international financial institutions?
Thank you, Andreas, and thank you, our hosts, for putting this platform together. We've had very rich and insightful deliberations, very aptly summarized by both Andreas and Professor Basri. So, but to bring in a larger audience and to raise awareness of these issues is a very important contribution. So I think I'll just pick on a few of the sort of one area that hasn't come up so far is what is the role of T20? Because after all, this is a T20 platform. So, and is it ideas? Is it big ideas? Or is it ideas that will be implemented? So there can be a conflict between this because people are reluctant to accept something new. It has to be debated for very long before it's actually implemented. But unless there are big new ideas, you won't really have big change. So I think that one can break this up into short-term and long-term. One very interesting issue which came up in our debate was that what is a big idea? What is the idea that can be accepted? So here in the short term, I think the big idea is the implementation of more sustainable finance for development, seeing this actually happen. Because this is an idea that has been debated for many years, and there are many ways this financing can be enhanced, but it hasn't happened. But today there's enough momentum built up among all stakeholders, enough push on this, enough discussion, and our group is adding to this momentum, I think, in a big way. So we might see this happening. I think among the country groups, the advanced economy, everybody is suffering from fiscal space limitations. So the idea of using capital more efficiently, balance sheet optimization, financial innovation, bringing in private capital where there is real money, all that is something that is acceptable. And ultimately, these institutions are shareholder driven. So if the shareholder countries, if G20 agrees this will happen, it can happen fast. So I think we need deadlines, we need that big push, we need things to happen this year, and it is quite likely that it will. But longer term, we need changes in governance in these institutions, we need more representation based on how economic power has changed. And this is something that is a long-term agenda. And I think this T20 can flag it, can underline it, partly because we have the advantage of a series of emerging market presidencies, very unusual. 4 emerging markets in a row are going to be chairing the G20. So while India can flag it, Brazil should take it up, pick up the baton, and South Africa run with it to the goal, hopefully. So that is a long-term idea that we need to flag. And then I think a very, very important contribution of this multiple emerging market presidency is, in today's fractured world, is to provide a platform where countries keep talking to each other, discussing these issues, arriving at some agreement, and moving forward in delivering prosperity to everybody. Because there are too many conflicts, but all of us have a stake in the globe surviving and humanity doing better. So here, I think now I want to pick on one issue that was flagged. Both Professor Basri and Professor Agarwal raised this, the problem of growing global inequality. And what can we do about it? So I think Professor Basri talked about finance and the exclusion from that so many people face. But I want to take a contrary view, which is that the innovation you are seeing these days, normally financial innovation and innovation in general favors the rich, because more research goes where you can pay more. But in India and in most countries now, we have 100%, 120% ownership of mobiles and very high ownership of smartphones. And this has enabled so much financial inclusion. People can reach global markets through platforms on the internet. The small village lady producing some handicrafts. So then UPI, there's a tremendous growth in that, which is just free. Talking, we can talk to anybody, we can make payments, which really reduces transaction costs. So what I'm saying is that innovation today actually favors the poor. And to the extent this is supported, it can really improve equality also. And for Professor Agarwal and this is a very important idea, that the poorer countries have a lot more to gain by working on the environment, by improving air quality, because they are so far behind and they have a lot to gain. So this is what I would like to flag as net zero opportunity. For many emerging markets, for low-income countries, there are huge returns to be made by investing in the green economy, and private capital has opened up to this, which is one reason why G20 and the MDBs can help sort of fructify or bring in this private capital. They can make very large returns because there is so much potential. Everything has not been done already. There's a lot to do. So, and then finally, I'll just pick on a couple of points. As I said, most of the points were very ably summarized. But the couple of points I want to pick up, I think again, Professor Agarwal talked about this, the role of CRAs. Again and again yesterday, this topic came up, how they are behind, they're stuck in standard ways of doing things which don't do justice to many of the burning issues. So in the context of MDBs, we have that for them to leverage their capital, if their callable capital and the priority creditor status is taken into account, then their risk of borrowing actually reduces 14 times. So the interest rates charged can be commensurately lowered. So there needs to be awareness of this among the CRAs, and this is an issue G20 can take up. Either set up a competing CRA that is not profit-driven, as Professor Agarwal was suggesting, and that can factor in these issues and provide competing ratings, or raise awareness among existing rating agencies so that they help in the more efficient utilization of MDB capital. The other issue I want to pick up is that of layering, or the whole MDB system working together to meet the goals of countries. If these goals are clearly articulated, then again, building on financial innovation, on better data availability, and sharing of risk, a two-way movement of information in today's age. There are many opportunities here for the MDB system as a whole to work with regional or MDBs located in regions, to work with national development banks, to move rapidly at scale, to take up, to protect natural resources, to take up green infrastructure, to improve the standard quality of life for so many people, and to save the planet from climate distress. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Goyal, and especially for clarifying the role of the T20. That was going to be my next question, but I have a new one for you. Yesterday also emerged that besides the direct relationship from T20 to G20, there could be a useful flow of ideas passing from T20 to T7 that I confirm we will host with ISPI and another Italian think tank next year. So I wanted to know if you share this view and how you think this could help the global agenda.
Right. That it's is this working? Yeah. So I think really this these, as I said, the big idea, the topic that we work to improve, make the globe more climate resilient is something that has resonance with all countries. And how there is a lot of scope to do this in emerging markets because they're so far behind. You know, so and we have the problem of debt because we're coming out of the pandemic and the Ukraine war. So therefore, if there are debt for nature swaps, while emerging markets governments are concerned about social issues, development, but a lot of these can be linked to the public goods, you know, really helping the lower, reducing inequality, helping quality of life for the less well-off. And here I think T7 also will agree with this because there is a spillover, you know, the global climate and this helps resolve problems of debt and debt resolution. So it's all win-win, and where there is a win-win platform with huge stakeholder support, I think there can be a lot of agreement across T7 and T20 on this. Yeah?
Thank you. And to address again Professor Agarwala, you made the point that there should be a more shared global governance that should include more the so-called Global South. Could you please elaborate on this?
Yes, I can try. I must confess, I am an economist, and I work on natural capital, green finance. I seem to be cursed with these microphones. And so my expertise is not geopolitics or international affairs. But what I can absolutely say is that, look, when the Bretton Woods institutions were developed, the global population was about 2.5 billion. Now, the developing world's population, in just a couple of countries, is almost 2.5 billion. Right? So there are around 5 billion people in the world for whom GDP growth, the increase in material consumption, is an absolute necessity just to bring them up to a basic standard of living, and that is twice the population that existed when the Bretton Woods institutions were developed. There's also 3 billion or so people in the world who are more or less okay, and a few hundred millions who are going to have to reduce some of their material footprint. So what does this mean for the global governance of these institutions? Well, the need for the increase in material consumption has doubled in terms of the global population since Bretton Woods was developed. There's an economy globally of about the same population from the 1950s when the Bretton Woods institutions were developed that sort of needs to reduce its material footprint and consumption. And so the same institutions that were there, the mandate's completely different now. I think that in order to help us move forward, these institutions need the sorts of data about the sorts of capital where the investments are going to be prioritized. And when we take a look at what we've learned so far from the existing natural capital accounts, we see that international trade, which is a hallmark of the WTO and the Bretton Woods system, is facilitating a transfer of wealth from these natural capital, natural resources that largely exist in the global south to the wealthy countries in the global north. So what are we seeing? We're seeing an accelerated transfer of wealth from the poor to the wealthy. And this needs to be captured in our economic statistics, otherwise that story goes untold. I think that until we develop the natural capital accounts, any investments that we make in protecting and conserving nature will show up once as an expenditure from the government in the national accounts, but then they disappear because there's no capital balance sheet that incorporates the natural assets of the country. And so governments cannot tell the story of how they're enhancing wealth because they don't have the statistics to demonstrate it. And I think it's probably fair to say that throughout the G20, the IMF, more recently, and hopefully in the near future, the World Bank, there has been a renewed focus on climate change. But climate change is not the primary issue, not the most urgent issue. It's biodiversity loss. The global pandemic that we've just been through has essentially nothing to do with climate change and absolutely everything to do with biodiversity loss. COVID-19, SARS, MERS, bird flu, swine flu, Ebola, HIV, every single one of these is a zoonotic disease that entered the human species at the interface of human food systems and previously wild ecosystems. That's our biodiversity management. That's our land use and agricultural system. And until that changes, we are still going to face risks from biodiversity loss, where the economic and financial toll is orders of magnitude greater than those from climate change, to say nothing of the human cost. And nothing that we have done through the pandemic, none of the governance institutions have done anything to change the fact that these emerging infectious diseases, 75% of which come from wild ecosystems and enter the human species through food systems. Nothing we have done has changed that. I think that's a really important story, that we must move beyond just climate and start to think about biodiversity loss as well.
Thank you, Professor Agarwala, for clarifying this. And I am convinced that what you said about natural capital could be applied as well to social capital. As a last question before opening the floor to the offline and online public questions, I would like to ask to Professor Basri, as he had both roles of expert and in political engagement, if he has an idea of what could be in this process the role of experts and in influencing politicians and how this could happen.
Thank you very much. This is a tough question, actually. Let me put this way. Of course, I was trained as an economist and my background is an academic, but I am humbled by the political reality. Yeah, that we are not living in the first best world like what we learned from the textbook. We are probably living in the third best world run by the fourth best bureaucracy. And that's the reality. Yeah, we cannot complain on that. So my take is always, let's work at the given constraint. So rather than blaming the situation, let's try to find a way to solve the problem. Perhaps will not be perfect, but we can start from that. So answering to your questions, I can imagine there's always a sort of like a tug of war between the academic world and then the policy making process, because on the one hand we are talking about the ideal world, about the ideal solution, but the political reality is maybe different. I always like to quote what Jean-Claude Juncker said. He said that we all know what to do, we just don't know how to get re-elected after we've done it. So let's work on the given political constraint. Yeah, my suggestion is, we heard a lot of great idea from the discussion of the T20. The problem with, at least in my experience, the problem with economists, every time we fail to convince the government, then we blame politics. We blame the institutional setup. But maybe we have to change our mindset, how to incentivize a politician to support the reform rather than blaming them if they are not supporting us. So with this approach, then one thing that came up to my mind, that is why my approach is very simple. I'm not, a sort of like attempted to do the uphill battle. Will be good if we can have this unlimited political capital, but maybe we can start with something relatively easy, but the marginal gain is very high. Let's start with something that relatively easy, that everyone can agree on. You create a success story, you gather the political support, and you move to the more complex and difficult issue. So let me give an example, like in the case of the G20 in Indonesia last year. We understand if we touch this issue about this, something related that could be linked to the geopolitical issue, that will be no consensus or agreement. But if we talk about something about issue that everyone would agree on, like health issue, like climate, or maybe you can talk about inclusion, yeah, then everyone will agree to talk about it. So my suggestion is perhaps for the T20, let's try to find an area, a common denominator that everyone can work together, and government understand if people feel the benefit of it, there is an incentive for the politician to take this opportunity to gather the political support, and they move to the more complex and difficult situation. So back to your question, Andrea, I think maybe if the T20 in India can sort of like point out some of the issues that we can work together, in which you have this common denominator between the research institution and the government, and people feel the benefit of it, then you can move to the more complex, difficult issue. Let me give just an example. This is the Indonesian case. Back on 2016, there was the shortest government regulations ever in the world. The lifetime was only 3 hours. That was the government decision, Indonesian government decision, to ban this ride-hailing. Yeah, the ride-hailing. It was on Saturday, it was announced by Minister of Transportation, they banned this ride-hailing because in our law, we did not recognize the modality of transport using the motorcycles. But since people feel the benefit of this ride-hailing, people protested through the social media. That regulation was announced by 9 a.m. By 12 p.m., the president canceled the decision. It only lasts for 3 hours. So you can imagine if you create a policy that people feel the benefit of it, you create a constituent, even the politician would agree on this because they need to have this political support. So that kind of model, that everyone feel the benefit, I believe that it will be useful to link between this research institution, the think tank, and also, like the government agency. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Basri. So now we can open the discussion towards the public. We will have before questions from the offline audience. So I just remind to those who would like to ask a question, if they can, of course, raise their hand, and if they can stand up so that the camera can...
Thank you, Chair, for the opportunity. I'm inspired by the logic that Professor Agarwal brought. It's quite interesting. I'm just being a bit more provocative. As I'm saying, I'm getting inspired by the idea. If you recall the ancient, or even the not very ancient, the rural India societies some time back, they used to explain their life in terms of how much of agriculture land they own, the prosperity, the so-called well-off people in the rural areas will explain their achievement in terms of, I have 10 cows, I have this much agriculture land, I have so many mango trees. Now the material consumption that you referred to, perhaps the dominant economic idea that has been unfettered way spread across the world in the humankind, that the metrics that you measure the success in your life. So can we say that at this point of time that I have 100 trees, I have this many animals at home. If those things comes back to, in the Indian presidency we have life where we are focusing on values, ethics, all these things. Perhaps there is a greater need for sensitizing people that how to define wealth. Everybody is in a race to bottom to earn more material possessions. You don't need absolutely 5 cars in a house, but everybody wants a car. I recall when in the University of Bombay, IIT Bombay campus, once we were going by a vehicle, then a professor was riding a cycle in the morning. Then it was about to meet an accident, and the professor said, you can always ride a bicycle. And people are laughing. In a campus of 10 kilometer radius, we can walk even, but we need a vehicle to go. So the petrol consumption, all this consumption flows from that logic that I need to grow in my life. I need to achieve something. If you aggregate all individual ambitions, the material consumption needs to rise. Industrial revolution in Britain was precisely to develop the technology so that you can produce at scale to meet the demand. So there is a need for that. Can we go beyond? Like I still embrace that I should have 20 cows at home. People have rural farms, they do that. They have the farmhouses, they don't need cattle, but they have cattle. They have goat, they have forest cover. Can we tell them that you are the richest person in the world? If we define the success and richness in that way, perhaps the logic that you are bringing would hold. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Could you also introduce yourself, especially for the public?
Yeah,
that is
myself,
online?
Priyadarshi Das. I am an associate professor with Research and Information System for New Delhi.
Thank you very much. You can take this, Professor Agarwal.
Thank you. It's an excellent question, and perhaps I was too brief and lacked the nuance that I should have shared. So thank you for providing that nuance yourself for us. I spoke about there being, say, around 4-ish billion people in the world for whom material consumption absolutely needs to rise. These are not the people with 5 cars. These are the people who still face challenges feeding their families, challenges getting access to medical care, challenges getting access to education or electricity or improved sources of drinking water in the home. Absolutely, those people need to increase their material consumption. It is not for me to tell different cultures or even individuals, you are wealthy, you are not wealthy. It is for me as an economist to try to understand, well, what are the capital assets that underpin human welfare, economic well-being, and a broad view of prosperity? And how can we manage those assets? And so that's what I try to do, and that's what I think that the notion of inclusive wealth can help us with. I think that although there is a large push for degrowth, and we've seen a major degrowth conference in Europe just a few weeks ago, I think that lacks the nuance that there's 4 billion people for whom degrowth is absolutely not an option. And you cannot have those of us who are privileged enough to be in this room, or those of us with access to potentially influence the G20 heads of state and economies, telling people that those 4 billion people should consume less. No, absolutely not. I don't think that's necessarily how these people could or should or would define their success in life. But absolutely, basic healthcare, housing, food, education, that's important. And it matters, it really matters, because when we don't have improved access, improved sources of drinking water and sanitation services in homes, what happens? Well, the burden of finding and sourcing and collecting and transporting water falls on women and girls, disproportionately, almost exclusively on women and girls. And that means that young women don't go to school because they have to go and spend the hours each day collecting water. That means, in addition to the unfairness and human toll of that, there's a loss of human capital. They're not going to school. When young girls begin to menstruate, if we do not have facilities in the schools, then they leave school. And that also reduces human capital development. When they're unaccompanied and they go to travel to collect water from a river or a lake, there are men there who have poor intentions, and the incidence of violence against women and young girls increases. So there's an effect that goes right across the economy of these consequences. When those young girls then become mothers, they haven't had the education. We know that one of the fastest routes out of poverty is for the mother to be educated so she can impart that wisdom onto the children. If we don't get this right and improve the material consumption, improve the access to resources for these 4 billion people, we are wasting half the world's potential human capital.
Thank you very much. I'm worried because I'm going back to my father and he really likes cars. So I will go back with bad news for him. But at least he enjoys old-style cars, so there's a form of sustainability in this. More questions. I don't know who raised the hand first, so maybe we can apply a gender balance.
That was a very nice criteria, I think. Very welcome. My name is Sandra Paulsen. I'm a Brazilian economist working at the Institute of Applied Economic Research, IPEA, in Brasilia. And my question goes to Professor Matthew Agarwala, because he emphasized biodiversity as an issue. And I think it's very important, especially for those economies like the Brazilian economy. We are known as a mega biodiversity superpower. And I would like you to, if possible, talk a little bit more about the importance of biodiversity, because I think there are misunderstandings around the fact that what we want is just to keep one or two species of rare animals or plants. And it's difficult sometimes to introduce the idea that biodiversity is the little brick that makes the whole of the wall of resilience and of the potential, the economic potential that our economies have. So I'd like to listen a bit more from you on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we can, I've seen that we have many questions, so we can take a couple more and maybe also address to other speakers. Here in the front, maybe? If you can bring a microphone.
Thank you. I'm Fuku Kimura, Chief Economist Area, Jakarta, Indonesia, and also teaching at Keio University, Tokyo, Japan. It's a very stimulating discussion, and it's great to talk about the sort of possibility of a new paradigm and others. That kind of discussion is very important. But at the same time, G20 should take care of low-income countries urgently. So maybe it's okay in the case of Indonesia and India. They are doing very well. But some low-income countries are in a really sort of close to crisis situation. So it's okay to talk about this really new paradigm, but at the same time, a sort of realistic approach that Chatib Basri proposed is also very important, particularly the linking from T20 to G20. You have to notice that in G20, G7 members are also members of G20. So we really have to have some sort of convincing agenda, and the G20 should produce some sort of concrete, workable ideas. Otherwise, that forum itself cannot survive. So I think I do not deny sort of talk about those big things, of course, but at the same time, some sort of practical approach is also needed. So in that context, I think to Chatib Basri, I think that my question is that certainly international financial institutions could do a little bit more, and also G7 should take care of, should play with responsibility to do this and this. But at the same time, Global South, particularly low-income countries, should do by yourself to be ready for coming into working with some you call the innovative financing scheme. So what sort of preparation is needed for them? I think that should be a sort of very important message from G20 to low-income countries. That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kimura, for bringing us a bit back to reality. And maybe another question, and then we can answer. Here in, yes?
Thank you. My name is Arun. I'm a visiting fellow at the Research and Information System for Developing Countries. I thought it was an excellent session. We covered a lot of ground on the limited fiscal space, the huge debt, especially the Global South, and the need for climate finance, and also this concept of natural capital, and also the net zero opportunity that Professor Ashima mentioned, and the operating model that Professor Basri brought in. My question is to Professor Matthew and Professor Ashima on the debt for climate and debt for nature swaps. Because I think here we're talking about huge debts of this Global South being forgiven in exchange for the investments in environmental conservation. I would like to know, how the IFIs can help in this regard, scaling up this debt for nature swaps, and also what are the limitations? It looks like it's too good to be true, this instrument. Thank you. Professor Ashima also, if could respond. Both Professor Agarwal and Professor Ashima. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And maybe Professor Raghav can start, then Professor Goyal and Professor Basri can conclude. and then we take another short round of questions.
Okay, I shall try to be more brief this time. First, to address Dr. Sandra Paulson's question, can I say a little bit more about biodiversity and how we can use the economics of biodiversity to improve outcomes? It's devilishly difficult to convey to a finance minister or a CFO just how important biodiversity is. I have tried to point out its role in agriculture, which is of course critical in Brazil. There are examples of crops where we have lost the pollinators. So the vanilla bean, if you have vanilla, and most of us probably had some vanilla this morning, it will have been pollinated by hand. There's only one kind of bee that actually pollinates the orchid that generates the vanilla bean, and it lives in a small range in Mesoamerica between 500 meters and 1,500 meters of elevation. Now, in order to cultivate vanilla, as we do in Madagascar and now in Vietnam and Cambodia, we have to pollinate by hand. And it was a 12-year-old boy by the name of Edmund Albus. He was a slave at the time, who found that he could press the pistil and the stamen together of the vanilla pod, or of the vanilla orchid, and he could pollinate the crop that way. So it was an entrepreneurial, intellectually curious child that developed that industry. And now that is exported around the world, but vanilla is one of the most expensive spices that we have. So it is a natural capital and a human capital story. The issue is the degradation of biodiversity and ecosystems in Madagascar. It means that that crop is also under threat. There's a substitution effect, right? So we can have natural capital, we can also have human and physical capital. So if we lose the natural vanilla, don't worry, we can also synthesize vanillin, which is the flavor compound, as a byproduct from a diesel fuel production process. So if you get synthetic vanillin, this might be where it comes from. I've had some success trying to convey the importance of biodiversity using the pandemic example. I think that it's insane that the way that we have cheap chicken in the UK is because we feed British chickens Brazilian soy, but this is the way the markets work. I'm going to push back on the idea that what I'm talking about when I speak about inclusive wealth is the big idea, but that we need to constrain the talk back to reality. I think that's completely wrong. Inclusive wealth is the reality. Those are the real assets on which economies depend. If the financial world doesn't wish to recognize that, that is up to the financial world. But it will find itself managing a smaller and smaller slice of the world's capital less and less well. And that will be problematic. And on debt for nature swaps, I think I would like to yield to Professor Goyal.
Thank you. We are seeing some of this happening, and I think this is part of the awareness and the recognition of both these opportunities and the challenges. So, and this can be scaled up. So, and it is a huge opportunity for many low-income countries where nature has been degraded because of use of wood for, you know, and various absence of proper drainage, sanitation, crowding. There is a lot that can be done and that can really reduce inequality, poverty, and improve nature, as well as meet green targets for advanced economies, for capital. And I think this is a more generalizing from that, apart from just debt for nature swaps, the idea of de-risking or providing loans that are conditional on natural calamities, yeah, or providing hedging benefits when there is a global volatility. So making a lot of this conditional on shocks that fall disproportionately on emerging markets and create volatility and spillovers, which would then be reduced. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kimura. Thanks for raising this issue. I think what we discussed in this session, we mostly focus on the supply side, the reforming of the international financial institution, but I couldn't agree more. I completely agree with you. It is also important to discuss about the demand side. It means that we also need to ask the middle and low income countries, the global south, to do their homework. Yeah, because we discussed yesterday in our class session my concern about what I call the chicken and eggs question. For Minister of Finance for the global south, the question is, show me the money. But of course, from the Bretton Woods institution, the donor country, their question is, show me the platform. Yeah, so I think this is related to your question. There are a couple of issues that the low middle income countries need to prepare. The first one is, for example, if we're talking about climate, the biggest challenge sometimes is not about funding. The funding is there, but the ability to deliver. So project preparation is very important. So I can see maybe the role of the MDBs here in providing the capacity building, yeah, like your institution to provide a sort of like advisory or technical, support related to that. So I can see the role of the international financial institution is not only supporting the global south by providing resources, but to become the intellectual pathfinder and trusted advisor. That's also very important, to become inclusive and strategic partner. Yeah, the other homework that emerging developing economies or global south needs to improve is greater transparency. We're talking about the debt distress, but there is a need for the greater transparency, the financial deepening, and also they need to be prudent in their fiscal policy. And last but not least, don't forget, if we are talking, we discuss a lot about this climate finance, but I don't think even though we mobilize resources will be enough if the distortion in the emerging market is still there. Because there is no incentive for the private sector to jump in if the government in many countries all over the world continue to subsidize fuel, right? So that kind of homework, I think, need to be done by the low-income countries in order to bridge this chicken and egg question.
Thank you very much for talking about introducing the demand side, which I see as very important also because of my previous experience in the Italian government taking care of the next generation EU funds. In that occasion we had a lot of funding, but we had most of the problems in providing help, technical help to, especially to local public administration. So it's a bit the same problem that you've been addressing. I think we can still take one or two questions, or we are a bit ahead of schedule, and then we can pass to the questions of the online public. There is one here and one there. If you could please introduce yourself and also be quick.
Thank you very much, moderator, and thank you, panelists, esteemed panelists, for the great insights. Professor Basri's short-lived policy is a good example of a people-centered policy making. My name is Linus Mofo. I'm a senior environmental affairs officer with the African Climate Policy Center of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. So I would like to think that even though the MDBs were established just after the war, and the situation was different as well elaborated by Professor Agawa, but it was a people-centered development outcome mandate. And I think that mandate still stands, whatever the case. And we discussed a lot about this yesterday, and I think whether it is about leveraging the AAA ratings to mobilize new finance flows, or getting new capital to invest for development outcomes, or being given more capital to take more risk so that more finance flows can come from the private sector, that mandate still is very relevant and has to be part of the architecture. And I couldn't agree with you more, Professor Agarwal, about the credit rating things. Again, I made this point and colleagues made these points yesterday, and I think a new architecture for credit rating must have to be in place for development finance, right? And one of the things that we did not, or has not come out yet, is the issue of illicit financial flows. Illicit financial flows. Yes, Africa has been suffering from poor these credit ratings which are unfair, high cost of capital and so on, huge demands for finance for climate action, for development, but at the same time, whilst the finance flows are not coming, a huge flow of capital is leaving the continent illicitly. The best conservative estimate is about 80 billion. Yesterday, I made the indication that our group of negotiators have estimated that just for adaptation alone, Africa needs about 85 billion a year. So if this new architecture, this new financial architecture can help to stop that flow out of Africa, we already raised the money that Africa needs for adaptation. And if this new architecture can try to recoup some of those funds back, we have money to invest in finance. So I would like to hear from the esteemed panelists how this new architecture of the financial system could help to stop these flows of illicit financial flows from Africa and use that as a way of mobilizing additional financing to these countries. And also the issue about the indebtedness and debt sustainability with a high debt to GDP ratio. Professor Agawa, you mentioned about green bonds being for a global good. Is there space in this system to say that the debt that developing countries like in Africa, they take this debt for green investments, shouldn't count towards debt for the GDP, because when it comes to in the debt to GDP ratio, then it increases that financial risk and so on. Is there a room to say that this type of debt should not be counted in that formula? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Who wants to comment on this? Professor Basri and Goyal. I think Professor Bhattacharya also wanted to add something. If you can provide him a microphone.
Thank you. So I just wanted to not miss the opportunity of the rather provocative and, in my view, important call to action that Professor Agarwala set forth. So I agree with most things he said, and a few things I don't, to make life a little interesting. So I do think that the time has come to ditch the economic model of the past and adopt a new economic model. And on demographics, I just want to underscore what you said by saying not only do we have a large segment of the huge imbalance in consumption between a few and the many, but we also have to anticipate that in the next 3 decades, we will add 2 billion people to the planet, all in the developing world other than China. And we have to think about their welfare. And so everything you said about degrowth is not the way, I totally agree, but it has to be a different one. Nick Stern and I call this the growth opportunity of the 21st century by ditching the model of the past. And the new model really has to be based on a very different kind of investment and innovation. Innovation gives us a way to actually have our cake and eat it too, because the South can actually leapfrog in the way they are doing things towards clean energy, towards better. I wanted particularly to make a point in this year about India's G20 presidency and Prime Minister Modi's initiative on life, and what he calls lifestyle for the environment. And what he's doing is in a micro way, picking up very much the points you are making and saying, based on behavioral science, that small nudges can actually produce big changes in behavior. And if those behaviors are reinforced by community, society, business, supply chains, and government policy, we can actually have a very, very powerful agent of change. And I think in this life movement, there is a little bit of tension because many in the West see this as anti-consumerism. It is not. It's actually, and I'm very impressed, I don't live in India, but if you look at what's happening in India, it's a country which has moved away from first use of plastics in a way that no G7 country has. So there is a lot of possibility of innovation in the way that we think, and I'd be very interested in, I didn't hear you mention that. On agents of change, and this is a question really for Pardede, finance ministers have traditionally been very conservative in the way they think. And you as an ex-finance minister, even on adoption of kind of sustainability, on change. One structure, of course, we have is the G20. Another one that I am personally associated with is the Coalition of Finance Ministers on Climate Action, which is co-chaired by Indonesia. And it's very interesting to me that, in 10 days' time, the coalition will be discussing the role of finance ministers in biodiversity action. So I think we need to use finance ministers much more as agents of change. And I'd be very interested in your views of how we can do that. A second pillar, as we've all heard, are the multilateral development finance institutions because of their role in policy, but also their role in finance. And the third that we heard very much from our chair is, and Ashima, is how do you use the financial system now as an agent and enabler of change? And in that, I agree very much with what was said by Professor Agarwala, that we have to think about new metrics, we have to think about the role of credit rating agencies, and we have to think about, in some sense, accountability mechanisms that hold actors. The one issue that I did not agree with, and that's why I thought I should say, there is no difference in urgency between climate and biodiversity. They are equally urgent, and they are reinforcing. The reason we have had a spread of zoonotic diseases is not just because of biodiversity failure, it's because climate change has greatly accelerated changes in ecological systems. So I think the urgency of action is reinforcing, it's not one or the other.
Thank you. Professor Basri, you want to start, and then if the other panelists want to add comments, of course.
Let me try to respond to your questions about the illicit financial flows, because I was involved in G20 when this issue was discussed back in 2009 perhaps, during the G20 in UK at a time. My short answer to this is we put it in the G20 about the issue of this illicit capital flows has to do with this financing for terrorism, proceed of corruption, etc. I think this is the issue that low-income countries, many global souths, need to improve as well by providing the greater transparency, improving the governance. But I can imagine at a time when we in the G20 adopted this communique about the illicit capital flows. The issue is many global south or emerging developing economies were not ready for that. So there is a sort of like a transition period towards this. And I think the multilateral development bank, the international financial institution, can provide a technical capacity or capacity building related to it to help the emerging developing economies to prepare for this. I do believe that I completely agree with you. If we can address this issue, your country risk will decline, and you can perhaps get an access for funding in relatively low cost. Yeah, that's my response to elicit the capital flows. And to your question, Amar, I couldn't agree more. Back on 2007, I think it was the first time when I was helping this to organize the finance minister meeting for the COP. I forgot what is a COP, the one in Bali, not the 13, the COP 13 in Bali. It was the first time there was a finance minister meeting, because the idea was exactly what you said. If we are talking about the effectiveness of policy, we have to look at the line of ministries who has these policy tools. And the one who has these policy tools, because they have the tax, they have this custom, budget, etc., are Minister of Finance. So that is why the role of the Minister of Finance is very important, talking about this climate issue, for example. The biggest problem in the past is we really focus on the issue about the short term. We did not take into account the effect, this externality. We really look at more on the private and social benefit in the short term. But once we taken into account about the issue of the social benefit, we include on this, it is very important for the finance minister all over the world to get involved in this, because exactly like what Nixon said, his famous quote, the cost of inaction, it's much greater on this cost of action, right? It is somehow, maybe there is a need to allocate some funding to even provide the Pigovian tax, etc. But this will ensure that the sustainability of this economy. And in the future, this will help also to position finance minister over the world for the fiscal sustainability, because otherwise I can imagine many countries in Pacific and even in Indonesia, if the sea level rising, then they need to allocate more budget related to that. So that kind of thinking is very important, and I'm glad to see that in many countries now, the issue of this climate become mainstreaming now. But the biggest challenge, Amar, I have to say that unfortunately in many emerging developing economies, I mentioned about this issue yesterday, climate is considered as the luxury goods, because we have to deal with the day-to-day problem, poverty, poor quality of education. So the challenge is how to put this issue to become a sort of like top priorities of many finance ministers in Global South. My suggestion to it is, to that is, how to link it with the issue of development. Yeah. So maybe the narrative is, rather than talking about the green economy, is like protecting the vulnerable groups, but using the green instrument. Then will become the top priorities of many finance ministers over the world.
Thank you very much. And if the other panelists don't want to add, yes, they want to add specific comments.
Just a very brief, I think, Linus, this problem of illicit finance, G20 has this agreement on exchange of information. If the countries participate in that and develop the measuring capability, then they can keep track. India is doing a lot of this, the Swiss bank accounts and so on, right? So I'm sure Africa can also. And your point about debt, not adding green debt to debt and calculating debt GDP ratios. I think if it's related to deep debt restructuring, right? So which will improve these risk perceptions, etc., rather than just and if it's much lower cost debt, that will all help. Then finally, I think for us in the TF5, although it's a finance track issue, I think T20 as a whole is much better integrated with the Sherpa process than the finance track. So finance ministry, for some reason, I think they need to be sensitized or brought on board more on these green issues. And this is a very important point, that they tend to have a short-term view because they're concerned with balancing budgets and afraid they'll be asked to provide more money for all this. Thank you.
Professor Agarwala.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your question on illicit financial flows. I know nothing about it. It simply reinforces how grateful I am to be here, because without it, I wouldn't start thinking about these issues. So I'm grateful for a chance to learn from you and to hear your comments, because this isn't a commonly discussed topic in my fields in the UK, and that's a problem. So thank you for that. On the issue of categorizing debt for nature separately from sovereign debt, I would need to think more deeply about it. One concern that I have is that if we don't get debt for nature swaps right, then we may undermine the incentives that debt markets are supposed to convey to all parties. And so the Jamaican catastrophe bond, supported by the World Bank, I think is a dangerous example of precisely this. So the catastrophe bond is a $100 billion bond issued by the World Bank using its AAA credit rating, because it can borrow cheaply. Jamaica pays the premium on that bond of 4%, which is much lower than Jamaica's cost of capital. If there is a catastrophe, category 2 hurricane or more severe, then the bond pays out to Jamaica, and it's the bond holders who lose rather than Jamaica. They've only paid their 4%. The problem is that the 4% premium that Jamaica is meant to pay was then financed by international financial aid rather than by Jamaica itself. So what's happening now is the World Bank has issued a bond for foreign investors to cover. The premium is paid by international financial aid, and Jamaica has no direct financial incentive to adjust any of its management anywhere in the process. And if we develop what we call financial innovation in a way that undermines these incentives, I'm really worried. Professor Bhattacharya, you should be up here rather than me. So thank you for your for the comments. I agree. So I did my PhD, in full disclosure, at the London School of Economics, and Professor Lord Nicholas Stern was the chair of the Grantham Institute while I was there. On the opportunity of the century, if any business accountant missed $100 trillion worth of value, that accountant would rightly be fired. And yet that is precisely what we do when we leave natural capital off the balance sheet. And so yes, I completely agree that investing in natural capital and maintaining its ability to deliver returns for the economy is the opportunity of the century. On innovation and competitiveness, we have new research which has just been released by myself and Josh Martin at the Bank of England, showing how productivity measures in the UK would be different if we factored in natural capital, specifically carbon emissions, PM10 emissions, and PM10.5, or PM10 emissions. In a country that is decarbonizing and reducing its emissions and energy intensity of output, observed productivity growth rises when we factor in these externalities. That's a great story. The UK is terribly concerned about the lack of productivity growth over the past 15 years. Unfortunately, if we take that same analysis to the developing world, we see the exact opposite. Rapidly industrializing countries are increasing the energy intensity of output. And so if we take the externalities there, observed productivity growth would fall. But these are the kinds of stories that we can tell if we have these accounts. On biodiversity being more important, more urgent than climate, I promise I'm about to end, I think we will likely agree to disagree on these grounds. Climate change probably kills 250,000 to 500,000 people a year in a generous estimate. Poor air quality, which is not unrelated, kills 7 to 10 million a year. The pandemic has killed over 20 million. I absolutely agree that climate and biodiversity are connected challenges in reality out there in the ecosystems. But when it comes to governance, when it comes to the sophistication of international agreements, the enforceability of treaties, the regulation of businesses and industries within countries, climate and biodiversity are not connected, not in the political and the legal sense. And what happens, the concern here, is that sometimes what makes great carbon policy makes horrible biodiversity policy. So biocrops for energy may be good for carbon. Hydroelectric dams on Asia's rivers might be good for carbon, but terrible for biodiversity.
Thank you, Professor Agarwala. So as someone said about how default happens slowly, and then quickly run out of money, we have been slowly using time, and then we almost run out of it. So I will read the question I asked to the event management to confirm that there is only one question from the online public, and it's a very long question, and maybe some of all of you can take it. One of the main reasons why GDP approach remains as the primary yardstick of economic prosperity is that it is more practical and less costly compared to the wealth approach. As we have a burgeoning pressure to tackle climate change immediately, what needs to be done to make the wealth approach measurement more viable than the GDP approach as soon as possible, so that policymakers have the former approach at the top of their minds when formulating and implementing policies? So who wants to take this? Maybe Professor Goyal, Agarwala, and you can all comment briefly on this topic.
I will just say a little bit. You know, when we were talking about debt for nature swaps and so on, one of the issues, or conditional aid, conditional on climate on asset improvement, one of the really important issues is measurement, because for the market to work, for this to be credible, you need to have much better measurements. So there is an incentive, I think, for many countries to improve and expand their statistical capabilities to be able to utilize some of this money coming in. In the same way as there's an incentive for firms to go green, because that affects their market and their exports. So we are seeing greater awareness and that capacity building that is required, which will expand the ability to measure different things.
That's a very good point, thank you. It was also a bit the point of Thomas Piketty. And Professor Basri, sorry, Professor Agarwala.
Sure. So what actions can be taken? Well, I think the G20 can take natural capital accounts and inclusive wealth seriously. They can do this by affirming a commitment to developing and producing and releasing regular natural capital accounts, as the G7 has done earlier this year. They could commit to adopting the UN system of environmental economic accounts, which has been agreed and approved by the UN General Assembly, both its central framework in 2012 and its extended ecosystem accounts in 2021. I will push back on the idea that it is more expensive to have wealth accounts than it is to have GDP accounts. The Office of National Statistics in the United Kingdom employs somewhere around 4,000 to 5,000 people, and 3 people are working on natural capital accounts. So we're not that expensive compared to the rest of the economy. I will accept, though, that inclusive wealth accounts alone will not save the world, but I do think that the ignorance imposed by their absence will certainly condemn it. Wealth accounts, information is costly, but ignorance is more so.
Thank you also for being sharp and brief. If you know you want to comment, it's fine. With this point on measurement, I think we have a bit completed all the spectrum of the topics. It has been a very full and interesting conversation. To conclude, I would like to thank our esteemed panelists, our public, both online and offline, and the T20, G20, the Institute for Economic and Social Research of the University of Indonesia, and the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And so, wish you all a good continuation with the separate sessions of online sessions of this afternoon. Thanks to you all.
Thank you to all the esteemed panelists for engaging in such an insightful dialogue. Throughout this public discussion, it has been a remarkable journey of knowledge sharing and exploration. Let's take a moment to reflect on the fruitful exchange of ideas and knowledge that we have experienced during this discussion. It is my sincere hope that this dialogue has been beneficial, providing us with new perspectives and deeper understanding on the topic at hand. Before we end this session, I would like to invite our panelists to a photo session, which will take place on the stage. The committee will help us in taking the photo, and without taking any longer, please stand up to take the photo. As for the next event, we encourage you to join the discussions on the Parallel Policy Brief dissemination that will be held at 1:30 p.m. GMT +8. You're welcome to join us by registering to the link on the chat room or at LPM FEBUI or CSIS Indonesia's YouTube channel. Lastly, to all invitees, I must inform that you are granted with the facility of an airport transfer. To claim the facility, please head to the concierge after the end of today's sequence of events. Once again, I express my heartfelt gratitude to all of you for your participation and valuable contributions. Let us continue to foster meaningful connections and knowledge exchange beyond this event. I, Gifari, am signing out. Thank you and have a wonderful day. Bisa lah, weh.